I'm here today to present to you some preliminary findings from a systematic review on the effectiveness of active support. And I'm going to spend a lot of time saying, don't believe everything you hear. So the findings I'm going to share with you today and the conclusions are preliminary because this is ongoing work. So things are likely to change as we are still sort of doing checks on the literature and analysing. But SSCR, who are funding this piece of work, were very keen that we share at this stage some of the results. So active support is a model for organising life in community homes to support adults with intellectual disabilities to maximise their engagement in activities of daily life. If you haven't heard of active support before, it's essentially an operational model for residential services. And it started around the 80s when people realized that just by moving people outside of long-stay hospitals and into the community, you wouldn't necessarily see the change that you were expecting in people's daily lives. They wouldn't necessarily do more things. They wouldn't spend more time engaged in meaningful and age-appropriate activities. So that's when active support came about, with the realization that we actually need to change not just the living environment, but the way we organize the living environment. And active support puts forward activity participation as one of the main outcomes because it believes that it's an indicator of several aspects of quality of life, and it's also a quality mark for service provision. So as an operational model, it has many levels. At the top, it's a philosophy of care that's very much person-centered and emphasizes what people can do, not what people cannot do. There's a system that is put in place in community homes that means that there are always activities for people to participate and staff support to enable that participation. And for this to happen, there's a system for training staff that involves training staff how to use the technology, but also training them in real time on how they interact on a moment-to-moment basis with the people with the learning disability, so as to enable engagement and maintain engagement in activities. Over the years, there have been a number of evaluations of the implementation of active support and a number of attempts to synthesize the evidence. So two of the reviews that were published in 2008 were not systematic. So they tried to be comprehensive, but they didn't follow the systematic review methodology that we all know now. These concluded that the implementation of active support very likely leads to increases in activity engagement and increases in staff assistance, but it's not very clear what's happening to some of the other outcomes for adults with learning disabilities in community homes. So, for example, some studies were finding increases in challenging behavior, some studies were finding decreases in challenging behavior. A couple of years later, there was indeed a systematic review and a meta-analysis of active support, but this piece of research decided to systematically review only experimental evaluations, and as a result of that identified only two relevant studies, and when they did their meta-analysis, the results actually were drawn from one study, the only study that could sufficiently demonstrate experimental control. So the conclusion was, on the basis of that one study, that active support is a promising but not evidence-based intervention. So even though we had 3 attempts at synthesis so far, I think it would be fair to say that existing syntheses are either not comprehensive or not systematic. The other reason why we need a systematic review at this stage is because there are more studies, more evaluations available, largely because the rest of the world became interested in active support a few years ago, and active support left the UK and went abroad. And even though there's quite a few decades now from the institutionalization, there is still very much a need to establish evidence-based operational model for residential services for adults with intellectual disabilities. So the research question that the systematic review wants to address is what is the effectiveness, what is the evidence on the effectiveness of active support to improve outcomes for adults with intellectual disabilities in residential settings? Just a little bit about the process. We did what you would expect. We searched online databases, we hand searched, and we asked loads of people if they have anything that is not published. In terms of our inclusion criteria, you can see the full list on the published protocol, which is on Prosper, on the Prosper database. I just wanted to draw your attention to one thing, which is that we try to be as inclusive as possible. Because I believe that we should make the best use of available evidence as we're trying to move forward to designing better and more influential research. So in terms of study designs, we were open to anything as long as they had baseline data, so we can actually look at the change over time. So our initial searches identified about 11,000 studies. When we applied the first inclusion-exclusion criteria, we were left with 58 studies to read, to access as full texts. And we then read that, two of us read that independently, applied the full list of inclusion and exclusion criteria, and identified 19 papers as eligible for inclusion to answer that question on effectiveness. And those 19 papers came from 13 studies, because people published a couple of papers from one study. Of those 13 studies, 9 were single group designs, so one group of people followed before and after active support implementation. 3 were controlled evaluations, so there was a comparison group. In all 3 cases, that was a support as usual comparison group. None of them were randomized. And there were 3 single case experimental designs. Now, you've probably guessed that doesn't add up to 13. And the reason for that is because 2 of the single case experimental designs are also included in the single group, the 9 up there. What happened here is that 2 studies were designed and took place as single case experimental designs, but the results were analyzed and conclusions were drawn as if they were single group studies, right? So there were multiple baselines, but they got an average for pre, an average for post, and they did a t-test, which is sort of inferential statistics you would do for a group design. So we decided to keep that and see the information that is coming from the 2 types of looking at things. And I'll show you in a minute how we did that. 3 studies came from Australia, 1 from Taiwan, and 9 from the UK. And by now you probably guessed that we were desperate to meta-analyze and be able to say something that has to do with numbers. So we decided we were going to meta-analyze. Instead of saying, oh, the studies are too heterogeneous, we wanted to be able to say something about the constructs of interest, say, for example, engagement, drawing on information wherever we could find it, and sort of being respectful for the design of the study. So we used one type of effect size for single group studies with pre-post data, another type of effect size for controlled evaluations, controlled group evaluations, and a non-overlap effect size for single case experimental designs. And these are some of our preliminary findings at the moment. When we look at engagement in any type of activity, sort of total engagement, that's social activities, non-social activities, the evidence is coming mainly from single group studies. There are more of them, and what we see here is an effect size that is suggesting small but significant change. This is backed up by the single case experimental designs studies, which are suggesting that the change over baseline 6 months following implementation of active support is approximately 60%. The improvement over baseline is approximately 60%. And what we see from the one controlled evaluation that's contributing data for this construct is a sort of larger effect size, but with very wide confidence intervals. So there's a lot of measurement instability there. And the outcomes are fairly similar when we look at the follow-up, 6 to 12 months after active support implementation. Breaking it down to more specific types of engagement, some studies measured engagement in domestic activities, things that you do in your house, or others called it non-social activities. Most of the evidence is coming from single group pre-post studies, and we see here Again, small to moderate, significant effect size, as we see from the confidence intervals not crossing the line of no effect, which is 0. The one controlled evaluation that did contribute data to this construct suggests that there is no significant change in domestic activity engagement, not at post, not at follow-up. But again, you can see that the confidence intervals are very wide. I can't fully explain this at the moment, but what I can tell you is that most of these studies used observational data, which is quite common in active support evaluation. This study was quite different. It was the one that happened in Taiwan, and the outcome measurement was staff-rated questionnaires. And the authors, the researchers, tried to explain this non-significant change. They didn't look at effect sizes, but they tried to explain the non-significant change by saying that it's due to staff reporting bias, that when staff realized what was happening, they took it more seriously at post. So, I don't know. Another type of outcome is staff assistance. So the behaviors that staff do to enable engagement and maintain engagement. Again, most of the evidence is from single group studies, and we see sort of small to moderate and significant effect size. There's no controlled evaluation data for this outcome. The effect size from the single case experimental designs studies is suggesting a similar kind of message here. The improvement over baseline according to this effect size is approximately 60%, 50 to 60% in the 6 months following active support implementation and in the 6 to 12 months after active support implementation. This is actually suggesting, single group studies are suggesting that staff assistance goes up over time. Some of the other outcomes that we're interested in, some of the other outcomes that have been measured and we want to meta-analyze, at the moment we've only done that for single group studies, suggest that immediately after active support implementation, so in the first 6 months, not much is changing. In the 6 to 12 months after active support implementation, we are beginning to see some small but significant differences in sort of reductions in mental health problems, reductions in challenge behavior, and improvements in choice. I am getting there, thank you. So, some conclusions at the moment. I think it's an obvious conclusion is that most of the studies are not controlled evaluations. At the moment, we are seeing some small but significant improvements in activity engagement, total activity engagement, and staff assistance. So these are the core outcomes of active support as active support was designed. We don't know exactly what's happening for other outcomes at the moment because we haven't finished with the analysis, but I think we are beginning to see that if there are going to be changes, these are going to be evident sort of in the follow-up period, not immediately after active support implementation. And that kind of fits with the logic model. Full interpretation is not possible at the moment. We're still analyzing. We have a number of subgroup analysis planned, and we are hoping to repeat the certs, the literature certs, once again after we finish to make sure that if there are other studies out there, and we know that there is at least one more study, we want to capture it. So not much to say in terms of implications at the moment, but the obvious one is that we need more controlled evaluations if we're going to draw any conclusions that are going to be have some kind of impact, and the complete absence of a randomized control trial is obvious. I would not like to draw any implications for practice at the moment until we have at least a full picture of the meta-analysis available. And as I said, some of these results stand to change when we repeat the certs. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. Thank you to the funder. And these are my own.
Right, perfect timing. Thank you very much. We've got 5 minutes for questions.
I'm just wondering what you... sorry. Hi, I'm Louise Schroders from the University of Leeds. So I was just wondering what you actually mean in, there's been an impact in engagement in some of these instances where there's a statistically significant outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But what does that actually look like? Like, what is that? Is that a sort of a practically impactful thing? 'Cause I want to say clinically significant, but I don't know what the correct terminology is in this non-clinical group.
That is a very good question, and the answer is we can't say if it's a clinically significant change, because there is an issue with the outcome, how we measure the outcome. So most of the outcomes have been measured as direct observations. So as observation schedules, they don't have sort of the research behind them to say, what is a clinically significant outcome? Is this change statistically reliable, and so on? Some of them have been measured with questionnaires. This is very new in active support evaluation tradition. There is a question, how can we best measure the outcome? This is one of the questions I'm sort of trying to look at the moment. From a practical point of view, when you go into a home and active support is happening, you can't miss it. It looks like engagement is happening, so you can see it. It has really good face validity, and that's why, to a certain extent, direct observations from independent researchers was the way that people were capturing the change following active support. But you can see, when you sit down to think about it, there are so many factors that can affect the variability of the measured outcome when it's a direct observation. And we haven't started exploring the factors, the measurement factors that affect the variability and have to do with the house, with the time of the day, number of observers that go in there, and so on.
Okay. Question back there.
Hi there. Well, that's amazing. Oh, hello. Sorry, I'm Deborah Chin. I'm from King's College. But actually, for many years, I was a practitioner. And I would say I tried to encourage the services where I worked to adopt quite a few different practice innovations. And I balked at active support because it requires a massive investment from the services that are involved. You say it's a technology, it's also an ideology and a long-term commitment. So given all of that, I just wonder what the kind of wider lessons we could draw from this. The issue is that this is still, although it's a technology that works in quite a few circumstances, it's one that is very, very hard to adopt. And on the other hand, the people who originated it are quite nervous about watering it down, so they do insist on kind of treatment fidelity. Who knows? I mean, I also wonder a little bit, if you were to do some sort of attentional control where you offer the same amount of an involvement and support to a service, whether you'd see improvements in lots of things as well. Anyhow, I guess it's a wider question about active support and what the findings might be able to show about kind of more bog standard services that are very unlikely to ever be able to take on the full strength version anyhow.
Yeah, I very much agree with this comment, and I think my starting point is that we don't actually know if it works. So that was the starting point for doing the systematic review. There have been a number of evaluations, and the general sort of discourse is that it works, but we haven't put the evidence to the test in the same way that we do it for other interventions, so by doing a randomized control trial or doing a systematic review. So that's why we're here today. So first, we need to answer the question whether it works or not. And there are a couple of ways of doing that. One way is doing the systematic review. The other question I think that you're raising is the most significant one is, okay, so what do we want to do with this thing? We want to create an evidence base for something that can be adopted, but most importantly, that can be sustainable. And there is a question about how can it be not just taken up, but can be maintained. We want to start exploring this question through the systematic review by possibly looking at what evidence do we have about the extent of implementation. And I can already tell you that there is very thin evidence at the moment about the sort of input, the implementation, and the outcomes. So I think there's a question to be asked at that stage, and then we can move on to saying, okay, if we're going to change that, how are we going to change that? Who's going to be involved in changing it? But I agree that it is a high-cost intervention, so we need to make sure that if we are going to promote its adoption, we need to make sure that we have some evidence that suggests that it works or it doesn't work, and it needs to be adapted.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. Thank you very much indeed. There are two very good questions. Pick my pen up. I got so excited. So, John Simmons, University of Bristol. Give you time to find your slides. And again, there could be time for questions immediately after the presentation.
Okay. Right, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about a study that I did with a colleague, Daryl Dugdale, about the experiences of fathers with learning disabilities of being a father and of adult social care services. So some brief background that UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2006 states that disabled people should have equal opportunity to experience parenthood. And that's supported by a range of government policies and documents from Valuing People, from the Department of Health, good practice guidelines working with parents with learning disabilities, recently updated by colleagues at the University of Bristol, working together with Parents Network. And also in terms of Department of Children and for Schools and Families in 2009, the Think Family Guidance, which recommended that both adults and children's services work across members of the family to improve outcomes, recognise the interrelationships within families. More recently, in the Care Act, one of the eligibility outcomes is when an adult has caring responsibilities for a child, and that social care practitioners need to consider adults' needs if they're in those circumstances. So although this is about fathers in relation to their children, there are implications for adult social care services within this. The research, the literature that's out there about fathers with learning disabilities, parenting with learning disabilities, focuses quite heavily on mothers with learning disabilities. There are 2 systematic reviews conducted in the last decade, and if the aggregated samples of that include 200 mothers and 19 fathers. So even though fathers do get included in research, the numbers, the kind of relative size of those samples are so small that the results can mask the particular experiences of fathers. Alongside that, there are a number of studies that focus kind of exclusively on aspects of being a mother with learning disabilities, and there are some examples there. But there are no kind of parallel studies about the experiences of fathers, to the extent that the topic's been described as virtually absent. That's a quote from back in 1990. Kilkey in 2007 talked about getting an agenda about disabled fathers in 2007, and the picture was largely the same in 2012 in another literature review. The research that we have found that considers fathers with learning disabilities in the last 50 years are these. So Peck and Stevens from 1965 did some questionnaires with fathers with learning disabilities. They used a different term, which was more in line with the dates there. But they decided that these men were not meeting their responsibilities and they were unsuccessful fathers, and actually concluded that this was evidence that no parents with learning disabilities should carry on being parents. Things have moved on. By 2002, Booth and Booth used interview data with mothers with learning disabilities to think about the men in their lives. Not all of those had learning disabilities. Clearly, it was from interview data with mothers not speaking to the men. I think it's Robert Strike is a father with a learning disability, and he wrote an autobiographical account with David McConnell in 2002, which was very useful from a kind of single point of view. And Hannah Sigurjóns's daughter, I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly, she did a doctoral dissertation in about 2004, which did concentrate on fathers, and that's been published in book chapter there, combined with mothers. And finally, Catherine Wade from Sydney with colleagues presented at a conference about practitioners' views about fathers, but again didn't speak to fathers themselves. So it's clearly a gap in the kind of broader literature, which we think is kind of the time is ripe really for something like this. So our study sought to understand the experiences of these men as fathers, to get their experiences of accessing adult social care services, also to speak to practitioners about their experiences of working with these men, and to think about how practice might be improved to best meet their needs. We conducted semi-structured interviews between the two of us. We tried to recruit 10 fathers and 10 practitioners from different parts of England. We did actually manage to recruit 10 of each group, but we couldn't. 2 of the interviews with the fathers had to be rearranged and then rearranged again, and then we weren't able to get there by the end of the study. Similarly with the practitioner, and we did some thematic analysis, which I'll talk about now. Briefly, their living situations. 4 of the men we spoke to were living with their children in the context of a 2-parent household. 2 were separated but had ongoing contact with their children. 1 was married but had just supervised contact with his children when the mother was present. And 1 was separated from the mother during the pregnancy. The child was adopted, but he's maintained letterbox contact with the child since then. These are the themes, but I'll skip over this and talk about them in more detail in the slides that follow. So a common theme across the fathers really was experience of discrimination growing up. 5 of them talked about their own father as in terms such as being absent, emotionally unavailable, rejecting them. Not in one example, the mother had left, and this father's own father tried to bring him up, but wasn't able to cope with him having a learning disability, and gave him to the father that we interviewed, his grandparents. So this participant was brought up by his grandparents. Another father talked about being told by his own father that he wouldn't amount to anything because he had a learning disability. 7 out of the 8 described being bullied at school. This might be either by peers in mainstream or in special educational settings, or actually by the adults who they commonly reported that they were made to feel like they wouldn't amount to anything, that they couldn't do this and couldn't do that. One of the older participants talked about that experience of being placed in the corner with the dunce's hat. And these were experiences which they carried with them, you know, and talked about quite vividly in the interview data. One of the ways that they responded to this, for some of the men anyway, was a real motivation to prove people wrong about what they were capable of. So these 2 quotes kind of sum this up, really. This is, my father told me I would never have kids, I would never have a job, I would never get married or live independent. I'm not married, but I thought 3 out of 4 is not bad. I've got a girlfriend, we'll get married maybe one day, but I proved him wrong. He's not working, and I am. So, and the kind of terms that they had were fitted in with the kind of traditional notions of what a successful man would be: independent, working, being married. And this was some of the stuff that they talked about. So this second father said, I was always told by school and other people, who was much younger, that I would never be able to have a job and never be able to live independently on my own, and I've proved them wrong. And actually being a father fed into this narrative of proving people wrong and being a successful man who was able to have a family and care for their children. The fathers gave us many examples of things that they did as fathers with their children, from things like changing nappies, getting up in the middle of the night to settle their children, managing kids' screen times and whether they should have tablets during the afternoons or not, having meetings with school, dropping their kids off at the school gates, very ordinary successes of being a father, and talking about how they learned that stuff. And sometimes it was from watching his ex-partner change his nappy and then growing in confidence in changing nappies himself, and also from other family members who were sources of support. There were particular pressures that they talked about as well, of being a father related to their experience of learning disability. So one father said that one of the things that he found difficult and related it to this was controlling his own emotions when the children were naughty. Another one talked about how demoralising it was for him to have to ask for help for people to read personal letters and the bills that he had to manage in the household. And a third father talked about the children's school, assuming that he didn't understand, and so only relating and communicating with the mother. So this quote here really seemed to kind of summarise this kind of pressure of other people's views of his capacities as a father and this kind of fear of getting things wrong. So he says, I laugh about it now, but I used to iron their socks, their pants, everything, because I was so worried that somebody would come in and say that I was doing it wrong and all the rest of it. I learned to sew, knit. I used to knit baby clothes for my daughter's dolls, plait her hair and things like that. But it was challenging, really hard times. And sometimes this combined pressure of managing tipped over into experiencing quite serious mental health difficulties. 4 of the men spoke of receiving support for serious mental illness. 3 of them had been admitted to psychiatric hospital, and this inevitably had an impact on their capacity to father and the relationship with the mother, sometimes as a result of which broke down. When they had support, as I said, this was support mainly received from the extended family, and it tended to be from female members of the extended family, and also from advocacy and voluntary organisations who provided parenting support. Their experience of statutory support from adult social care services tended to focus on and acknowledge their needs as individuals in terms of independent living, shopping, finances, but didn't engage with them around parenting and related emotional support, which tended to be focused on the mother. This father described it quite strongly in saying that services kick the father to the curb. Now, given that they had strong experiences of emotional distress, the absence of support for emotional support and practical parenting tips was something that kind of struck us. Interviews with the practitioners fell along these lines that fathers were in the background of their work, that parenting is seen as a children's services task, that there were challenges with working across agencies and departments, but there were some examples of kind of people's commitment and successes that they'd managed. So it was, most of the practitioners had experience of working with 2 or 3 mothers with learning disabilities, but it was very rare that they had a direct experience of working with a father with a learning disability. And they gave different reasons about why this might be. So often fathers' details were not included in referral information. Fathers could be perceived by some practitioners as just absent and not playing a part. Possibly is not contributing usefully. Are fathers just inherently more lazy than mothers? Was one view that kind of got discussed in the interview. Maybe practitioners view fathers as in terms of risk, through a lens of risk, rather than engaging with them about their own kind of welfare. Maybe it just reflects a prevailing culture within society that parenting is a mother's task. Challenges working with children's services. Actually, only one practitioner talked about the outcome in the Care Act about an adult having caring responsibilities for children and what the implications were for adult services. There was much discussion about the different conceptions between adult social care and children's services about what behaviour was considered risky, how much progress should be expected by parents, and what timescales were realistic to expect that progress. A couple of examples of good practice that came through. 2 practitioners who did quite extensive pieces of work with men focused on their mental health then ended up doing quite detailed bits of work around their identities of fathers because they were very closely interrelated, although that wasn't the original focus of their work. One manager used the Think Family framework to try and bring strategic managers and departments together to create a forum for parents with learning disabilities. And another manager had experience of working in both children's and adult services, and she was able to draw on that to negotiate kind of fair packages shared between the two. So if we were going to make some tentative recommendations for practitioners, it really would be just to insist on basic information about fathers in any family, whether the father is known to have a learning disability or not, and to make separate contact with them to discuss their role and feelings about their child, about being a father. To include them in practical parenting support, whether or not they themselves are delivering that support. For managers to draw on documents such as Think Family, Good Practice Guidelines, the Care Act, to act as levers to bring services together. And there did seem to be an issue for us around this notion of adults having caring responsibilities stated in the Care Act, and how much that message is getting through to practitioners, and what the relevant responsibilities should be between adult social care and children's services. There are some references. This is the disclaimer. I won't do it in the style of The Usual Suspects, but I was tempted to. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
John will have to explain about the style of The Usual Suspects later on, but it was a little challenge was going to be. Comments, questions? Yeah. Going to go in Romeo, then back. First hand up.
Thanks, that's really interesting. I just wondered if there was any cross-referencing with, I know, research that Breege, Featherstone and Huddersfield has done on engaging fathers anyway, whether they have a learning disability or not, whether there are similarities or not?
Yes, huge overlap really with the existing research, which is mostly done within context of children's services around engaging fathers, including fathers' details. So many of those same issues were kind of evident to us in how these fathers were related to by services. We were looking particularly at kind of what the implications might be within the context of adult social care to try and kind of bring that across. But yeah, I mean, lots of great work that Breege has done on that.
Yeah, 2 things. One, were there any gay couples?
No, there weren't.
And 2, and please forgive me for linking this to a previous issue, but Professor Knapp is aware.
Can you just keep it on the topic of the...
It is on the topic.
Okay.
It is on the topic. It is the question of risk.
Mm-hmm.
That risk, whether you're fighting abroad or battling at home to make ends meet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a comment, just that for some people, it's the same, they're figures.
Just be very briefly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, very
What's your
brief.
question? Just turn into your question, if you don't mind.
Might this be relevant to the figures we have for road traffic accidents? 1,732 deaths in 2015 alone. It compares with 682 deaths for servicemen in 10 years. And of course, you make allowances for the number of servicemen as opposed to the size of the population. But I think it's an area, you think that might be a useful comparison when we're looking at the, and again, my concern is with the discipline of psychiatry, because if we're going to get people going into courtrooms or any forum making arguments based on psychiatry and, stress and levels and these types of things, we want to be as objective and research-based as possible.
I mean, certainly the levels of stress that these men experienced had had big impacts on their relationships and their capacity to care for their children, and how they managed it. Actually, the experiences that they told us about of receiving support from mental health services was very positive. And although the focus was on their mental health, as I said, it was it did tend to kind of tip into then talking about, well, how do you relate to your daughters that you have contact with but you're not living with, and what kind of things might be helpful for your daughters to see you doing when you have that contact, so that you can maintain that relationship. We didn't have any participants who are members of gay couples, but that is an area. There's edited collections by Michael Lamb, which includes chapters around gay fatherhood, and that's certainly an area which needs more investigation.
Okay, any more comments or questions? Sorry, lots of exercise in this session.
Hi, I'm Michelle McCarthy. Did all of the mothers of the children have learning disabilities?
Off the top of my head, certainly most. I'd have to do a mental kind of check through with that, but yes, I think broadly.
Okay, because I was just interested in, because you said in the Booth's study, and certainly from my own practice and research experience, often mothers with learning disabilities have children with men who don't have learning disabilities. Yes. And I was just wondering whether there was any kind of similarity here or crossover. I suspect not, but I was just interested to know.
Just having running through them now, the ones, yes, I can only think of one participant. I don't know whether it didn't come up as to whether she did have a learning disability or not, but certainly all the others that I can think of, they did. But yeah, I mean, that paper's interesting in terms of sometimes the men involved in those families don't have learning disabilities, and varying degrees of support. So.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Do you want a quick question, quick response? No.
Yeah, Rachel Theisen, University of Nottingham. Really interesting study, thank you. It was just kind of, I suppose, linked to what Michelle was just asking, but it was actually about, obviously, these people who self-identified as having a learning disability, how many of them would have been eligible for adult social care, learning disability services? Because one of the problems generally is that parents with learning disabilities are not eligible for any kind of support, and they only get an intervention when something's gone wrong, whether that's child protection, mental health needs, or whatever. I just wondered if you've got anything to say on that. Yes.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I mean, I didn't include it here, but I think certainly 2 or 3 of them said that the thresholds for support from statutory services are too high. We don't meet it. Then their experience of children's services is around investigations when the concerns have been raised. And it did raise a gap in terms of what support services are there to support people before things go wrong. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John.
Thank
you. So, Rachel Clawson from the University of Nottingham, we'll try and find your slides. Over to you.
Thanks. Gosh, nearly 4:10. I've got the last slot. The best slot, yes. So I'm going to be talking to you about our project, which is looking at forced marriage of people with learning disabilities, and it's funded by the NIHR SSCR. The views that I am going to be presenting are my own. I don't have a slide saying that, unfortunately, but they are my, I know. They are my own views. Oh, no, how do I go back one? Oh, sorry, everybody. So we thought it might be useful to first of all identify what a forced marriage is. So a forced marriage, here we see the definition. It's a marriage conducted without the valid consent of one or both parties and where duress is a factor. That's the definition used by the Home Office and Foreign and Commonwealth Office Forced Marriage Unit, and that's the definition that we are working to. So forced marriage is now against the law. The act of forcing somebody to marry is against the law. The law changed in 2014 to make this act, to make it illegal. So the new offences are that it's illegal to force somebody to marry against their will, or to use deception to cause them to be married, so to take them to another country, to trick them into thinking that they're going to a party, or they're going to visit a relative. But I think most importantly, in relation to people with learning disabilities, the new legislation made it very clear that it's an offence to force somebody to marry if they lack the capacity to consent to that marriage. And you can see here it says the offence is capable of being committed whether or not violence, threats or any other form of coercion are used. Now this is actually really, really important, because prior to this, the idea was that forced marriage very much involved coercion. As we just saw, or as we can see here, the definition involves coercion. Now for people with learning disabilities, very often coercion doesn't happen, and the person might be really happy about the fact that they're going to be married, they're going to a party, they've got new clothes, jewellery, doing what their brothers and sisters have done, and and it's a great occasion. So it's really important to understand that it's possible to commit this offence whether or not coercion is used. This current study it's a 2-year study. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in a moment, but it builds on work that I've been doing for the past 8 to 10 years with the Government Forced Marriage Unit. So there's a number of projects that I've been involved in looking specifically at this issue. The Forced Marriage Unit, I first spoke to them in 2008 to find out what they knew about this issue, and they didn't really know very much about it at all. So they funded me since then to do a number of pieces of work, one of which led to me writing the practice guidance on forced marriage and learning disabilities, and that guidance is now included in the new, well, it's not new now, the 2014 statutory guidance on forced marriage, which was produced after a change in the legislation. So the aims and objectives of this current research, it's about changing practice, it's about changing safeguarding practice and about increasing understanding of forced marriage. The previous work that I've done has talked a lot to practitioners about what they understand about forced marriage with people with learning disabilities. We talked to safeguarding boards, but what was missing from the research were the voices of people with learning disabilities themselves and their parents and carers in trying to understand why this might happen. So the current research aims to increase understanding and awareness of forced marriage and develop resources to help practitioners. So we want to really get to grips with who the people with learning disabilities who are most at risk of being forced to marry and why that might be the case. We want to get knowledge from the different stakeholder groups, so people with learning disabilities, family members, faith leaders who play a really key part sometimes in this decision making, and of course practitioners as well, to get an understanding about why forced marriage happens, what people understand about levels of consent, levels of capacity to consent, and what issues are involved in assessing that capacity to consent. I think we should say that, obviously we all know that talking about people with learning disabilities, I'm talking about a huge spectrum of people. Very often the government response was to is in terms of thinking about people without the capacity to consent, and actually not thinking of those with the capacity to consent who may also be tricked or duped into being married. So the project is in 3 phases. We have completed phase 1, which was an analysis of all the records that the Government Forced Marriage Unit holds, which I'll talk to you about in a second. We're in the middle of phase 2 at the moment, which is interviewing the different stakeholder groups. And then we will move into phase 3, which is about developing outputs from the project. And the outputs are going to include guidance and a toolkit to support practitioners in assessing capacity to consent to marriage. So we're going to be working with a group of practitioners, identifying what some of the key issues are, what some of the problems are, but also identifying good practice. I've been working in this field for a long time now, and there are pockets of good practice around the country. There are other areas where people don't know what to do in terms of assessing capacity to marry. We're going to be producing a film. We're working with people with learning disabilities and their families and carers to produce a film that will raise awareness of the issue. And we're going to be writing some detailed case study reports which practitioners can use to help them understand what the characteristics might be of the people who might be at risk. There's also a website that you can look at if you would like more information. So phase 1, findings from the FMU. The FMU started collecting data on people with learning disabilities in 2010. It was a recommendation from the first piece of research that I undertook that was funded by them. At that point, they didn't know how many people were being reported to them. We knew that there were people with learning disabilities being reported because anecdotal evidence told us that, but they started counting the statistics in that time. So we've looked at 554 cases that were reported to them between the end of 2009 and 2015. And the findings indicate that actually there are two really interesting differences between people with learning disabilities and those without learning disabilities who are being forced to marry, and that's around gender and the age of the victim. So we can see here the number of cases that have been reported over the years, from 15 in 2009 up to 141 in 2015. These are just cases of people with learning disabilities. That's not to say that forced marriage is, happening, is occurring more often. I think that we're much better at recognising that, and I think practitioners know much more about the forced marriage unit and the advice that they can give, so they're contacting them. These figures are likely to be the absolute tip of the iceberg in terms of the actual numbers of people being forced to marry, but these are the cases reported to the FMU, and it's the only point in the UK that collects data at the moment in relation to this. So we can see here, this shows the gender of people being forced to marry, and you can see in most years there are more men than women being forced to marry people with learning disabilities. This is in stark contrast of all cases. In relation to all cases reported to the forced marriage unit, they tend to be 80% female, 20% male, and that's been steady over the last few years. So between 75 and 80% female. So you can see here that actually, according to the figures that the FMU have, men are just as likely, men with learning disabilities are just as likely, if not more likely, to be forced to marry than people without learning disabilities. So that's a key understanding for practitioners and policymakers, because at the moment a lot of the policy guidance really does focus on young girls, young women and girls being forced to marry, and largely ignores the very specific needs of men in this area. That's a lot of figures to be looking at at 4:15 this afternoon. Essentially, all you need to know is that the figures in red are the percentages for all cases. The figures in black are the figures for people with learning disabilities. So we can see that in many cases that are looking at the different age bandings, people with learning disability, or what you need to take from this is people with learning disabilities are generally forced to marry at a later age than those without learning disabilities. In most years, this has been the case, that people with learning disabilities tend to be that little bit older than people without learning disabilities. Some of the research that I've done previously can shed light on these two these two issues about age and gender. I mean, obviously, the research that we're doing at the moment will help us get a much better understanding of this, but research in the past has shown that the motivators for forcing somebody with a learning disability to marry differ tremendously from a motivator for forcing people without learning disabilities. So obtaining a carer is one of the main motivators, and that's coming out in the research that we are doing at the moment, the interviews we're doing at the moment. So if you think about, men with learning disabilities needing support as much as women with learning disabilities do, and people going from children's services to adult services, that time of transition, moving into middle adulthood where parents perhaps aren't able to offer the care and support that they have done in the past, that might give us some idea about why these changes are taking place, or why those changes are in place. So recording cases of people with learning disabilities are particularly high in London, West Midlands, North West, North East. There probably isn't, that's probably not a surprise, because they're the areas that show the highest rates of reporting for all cases as well. And figures for Yorkshire and Humberside have increased, but again, that's for all cases. Across all years, Pakistan tends to be the country that has the highest number of recorded cases, closely followed by Bangladesh and India and the UK. And again, this probably isn't a surprise in that we have large settled communities from those countries in this country, and they're communities that really value marriage and value marriage, and I'm making huge generalisations here, and tend not to access health and social care support in the same way as perhaps white British people do. In terms of who reports forced marriage to the forced marriage unit, it very much tends to be frontline professionals, so social workers, police, community learning disability nurses are the people reporting rather than the victim themselves. There are some cases of the victim themselves reporting and family members, but they're very, very small numbers. So actually the FMU is a huge source of support and advice to frontline practitioners who may be working with people that might be at risk of forced marriage. So moving forward into phase 2, as I just mentioned, we are already generating some really interesting data, strong themes emerging around why families make a decision to have their son or daughter married and the consequences of not doing so. There are also some really interesting themes emerging around understandings of capacity to consent and who decides upon that, and whether nodding and agreeing to being married is actually giving your consent or not. And I think it's worth just reminding ourselves that actually, I think sometimes when I give presentations to practitioners are saying what people with learning disabilities should be getting married. Of course, people with learning disabilities should be able to be married, to choose to marry if they have the capacity to consent and they're willingly doing that. That's not what this project is looking at. It's looking at people who either do not have the capacity to consent or who may be tricked or duped or coerced into giving their consent. Okay, thank you. That's the end of the presentation.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Questions, comments? If you could just put your arms up, alternately this side and the other side, then it's good for the steward to get us.
Hi, my name's Alex Truscott. I'm from the Challenging Behaviour Foundation. I'm just wondering whether your figures break down at all whether people have a mild, a moderate or a severe learning disability?
No, unfortunately not. What we're working on is the forced marriage unit figures, and they count learning disability, but they do. We're looking at individual cases, and from the case notes we can deduce, to some extent, what the level of learning disability might be. But no, unfortunately, the data doesn't allow for that.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Good. Pass the mic along.
Hi, I'm Claire Bates from the University of Kent. I heard you speak at an Anne Craft conference a few years ago, and one of the findings I remember from that was that it was always kind of a raw deal for the woman, regardless of whether she had a learning disability or not. She was either sexually abused, possibly by a male who didn't have a learning disability, or treated poorly. And if it was a woman that was brought over to marry a man with a learning disability, she became an unpaid carer and often didn't know. Have you found that in the next in your phase 2 as well?
It's really interesting. The people that we've spoken to with learning disabilities so far, only one of them has been married, and it was she was a woman who perhaps didn't have the capacity to consent to marriage, but didn't disclose anything within that interview. So we haven't come across that in the interviews yet, but we're only part way through. But yes, that came through strongly in previous research, yeah.
Hi, Deborah Chin from King's College. Do you think we've got the terminology right in using the term forced to include a group of people where there isn't anything that
Yeah.
their families or community
Yeah.
would see as forcing,
Yeah.
but clearly there are issues around their capacity to
Yeah.
consent
Yeah.
to this step in their lives.
I think it's a hugely, hugely problematic area, because I think that one of the things that we need to look at, and interestingly, this is one of the things I've been thinking about, following this research, what's the next step, is what we leave people with when because in some communities, not being married obviously carries a huge stigma, not only for the individual themselves, but for the family, for brothers and sisters. Equally, being married might be a really negative thing if you're married to somebody that's going to exploit or abuse you. But I think one of the issues that I'm concerned about is what we leave families with when, as practitioners, we might be assessing people as not having the capacity to consent, but people might be might be having a meaningful relationship, or families then may be further stigmatised by this decision that they can't get their son or their daughter married. I don't know if the terminology is right or not, but I think that we're at the beginning of our understanding of it, really, and I think the whole issue is so complex, which is one of the reasons why we decided to talk to all the different stakeholder groups, to try and get views from different groups about what the consequences are for not being married. We know more about what the consequences are for being married, but what about when you're not married, when those decisions are made for you not to be married? So it's complex, and it's there's still a lot more that we need to know.
Okay. For comments or questions to Rachel?
Thank you. Mark Holloway from Headfirst and University of Sussex. A lot of what you say has echoes for me in relation to brain injury, when thinking about older parents with brain injured children who are adults, and I've had a 20-year experience of working alongside some families where they look to their person to have a relationship, knowing that when they decease, somebody will be there, and knowing that they can't rely upon statutory services to provide that necessary support. I've been involved in a number of cases where older family members have been happy to see their brain injured son or daughter in a relationship with someone they don't actually think is very suitable, but it's better than no relationship at all. And it really is around, quite literally, will medication get taken, will food be eaten? And I think there's some clear sort of link there with your research too.
Yeah, certainly. It certainly sounds that the previous research has shown that one of the strongest motivators is trying to find a carer for when parents are no longer able to provide that care. Yeah.
Okay. Opening up, we've got a few more minutes. Any more questions generally in the session for Basso, for John, for Rachel?
Just
Quick
a quick.
question. Wait for the mic. Just wait for the mic and catch it on the recording.
Yeah, the word deception. I thought that's problematic. Many people, male and female, might claim they've been deceived into marriage.
Yeah, does any of us know what we're letting ourselves in for?
Might be a very good thing to stop that. We've got one question at the top of the back. We'll make this the last question. Comment? Whichever. That's fine.
Thanks, Roger. I've got two. Stephen Joseph, Royal Holloway, University of London. Two questions. One relates to the idea, the question that was asked by the lady here about the title of it, calling it forced. Could there be other way, to really describe it? Because if somebody hears, they've been reported, a case has been reported to a forced marriage, that word force itself, that holds a huge connotation, doesn't it? And the second aspect is, I was wondering to what extent some of the statistics you have, has there been any Anglo-Saxon cases?
Yes.
Or?
Yeah. In fact, the first case that was reported in the media was of a white British woman. This was 2010 it was Reading Crown Court. It was reported in. It was heard in a white British woman who'd been sold by her brother to a Chinese man for a visa. So there are cases. I think it's really important to understand that that forced marriage doesn't only happen within South Asian communities. I think in the media, that's often what is portrayed. But actually, the forced marriage unit dealt with cases from over 90 different countries a couple of years ago. So, it can happen to anybody from any community.
Thanks. And also, finally, the idea, my question now centers around culture. Because it seems like predominantly the figures, tend to relate more to the Southeast Asian community. Has there been studies around that? And do you has there been studies around the cultural influences around that? What the cultural beliefs have been, or do you intend to conduct more studies in that area?
There's a lot of research looking at culture and understand or thinking around marriage, relationships, what's important within particular families. The idea of here in the UK, the individual is important. In other communities, a collective responsibility is more important. So there's lots of research looking at that we're drawing upon in making our analysis of the data that we're collecting.
So areas like individuality and the other side of things, basically.
And collectivism, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to draw things to a close. So, 2 or 3 things to say to finish. Firstly, thank you to Vaso, John, and Rachel for excellent presentations. I'm really proud that SSCR is funding those studies. So let's just thank them again. Thank you very much.